All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Cheshvan, Stephen Terry Zinn, for dedicating all of his Shomer Drushos this month in memory of Steve's father, Bunim Tzvi Ben Chaim, on the occasion of his 18th yahrzeit. To thank Leah Sol for dedicating all Shomer Drushos this month as a schus for Refuah Shalema for her daughter Ilana Bas Esther, and the schus for Refuah Shalema for all of those wounded in Eretz Yisrael. Jonas and Rachel Wolf for a complete and lasting refuah for Rafael Yitzchak Baruch Ben Esther, Jerry and Sarah Wolaski, in the schus for Refuah Shalema for Zechariah Dov Ben Perel Shira, and Azriel and Iris Miller, in the schus of the holy soldiers of the IDF, and in the merit of our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael. We of course also thank our Week of Learning sponsors, an anonymous sponsor in honor of, he's not here yet, all right, Yomi Frager's birthday. Make sure to remind him, in case he forgot that it's been his birthday, make sure to remind him when he gets here, Meretz Hashem. Also, we hope that in the merit of all of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, those who need a refuah should have one together with Kol Chole Yisrael. The family should have a nechama, and of course, again, our holy and precious soldiers should, Meretz Hashem, have Hatzlacha B'chol Ma'asei Yodehem, and our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael should only know Bracha, Simcha, and Shalom. We'll say with that, let us begin. So we have a lot to do today. Baruch Hashem, today's daf is Ayin Hey 75. Sorry. Good. Today's daf is Ayin Hey, and we are picking up on Ayin Daled Amud Beis 74b. We left off. Let's actually pick up with Ella Amar of Nachman Amar Baravua Hacham b'Mamzer me'achos u'Mamzer me'ishes ish iko beinayu, which is actually not so far up. It's only 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16. Okay, 16, 18, 20. It's 21 lines up from the bottom. Okay, not so bad. So let's just remember again. If remember, we focused on a Mishnah yesterday, and in our Mishnah we're trying to create a rule, right? A klal. So the Tanakama said that the rule is kol asurin lavo bekal mutarim lavo zebazeh. Literally translated, whoever. So again, Tanakama said, whoever is usher to come, whoever is usher to marry into the general assembly of Klal Yisrael, anyone who is usher, ultimately, again, those individuals are permitted to marry one another. Then the Mishnah said, Rabbi Huda Oser. Rabbi Huda says it's Aser. Now we spent all of Amud Beis yesterday trying to figure out what is Rabbi Huda saying. Like what is obvious here? There's a machlokes going on over here. What is the nature of the machlokes? So the truth is, we floated a couple of different suggestions, and now the Gemara says as follows: Ella Amar Nachman Amar Rabba Baravua Hacha Mamzer Me'achoso uMamzer Me'ishes Ish Iko Beiner. We'll say, what is the point of contention between Rabbi Huda and the Rabbanon, or the Tanakama? The point of contention, both say, is what is the halachic definition of a mamzer? Now remember again, different arayos, we classically think that the definition of a mamzer is if a man has a child with any woman with whom he cannot marry. Right, and or to say differently, and with whom that relationship is punishable by death. Now remember again, in the world of punishable by death, there's different forms of death. There's kares, there's misa b'dei shamayim, right, and there is misa b'dei adam. So this kares, like a spiritual excommunication, misa b'dei shamayim, death at the hands of heaven, and misa b'dei adam, a death sentence in a human court. Different. So for example. The halacha is as follows: if one has relations with his sister, then ultimately, again, that's a chiyuv kares. And yet, if one goes ahead and commits adultery, ish, that's chiyuv misa in a beis din. Now, I will say, so the machlokes the Gemara suggested between the Tanakama and Rabbi Huda is which type of relationship creates a mamzer. So watch this. So the Gemara says, Tanakama savar afilu mamzer mechoser. And I will say, everyone agrees that a relationship punishable by misas beis din, right, by death at the hands of a human court, everyone agrees that creates a mamzer. So for example, everyone is going to agree that an adulterous union which produces offspring, ultimately again that offspring is going to be a mamzer. That everyone agrees with. The machlokes case is, what about a kares case? What about a kares case? So a man goes ahead and has a child with his sister. Is that child a mamzer or not? It's Pshat Mamzer. So the Gemara says, Tanakama Sarafi Mamzer Me'achoso, Nami Havi Mamzer. So Tanakama holds that even a mamzer that comes from a sister, in other words, even a child that comes from a chi of kares is called a mamzer. Rabbi Yehuda Savra Me'eshes Ish Havi Mamzer Me'achoso Lo Havi Mamzer. And Rabbi Yehuda on the other hand holds that no, only a mamzer that comes from a chi of misas bezdin ultimately is a mamzer, but a child that is the product of a union that is illicit and that is illegal and that is immoral, but doesn't carry with it a misas bezdin, ultimately, again, that's not a mamzer. So the Gemara is suggesting that that's the point of contention in the Mishnah. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. What is the Mishnah then coming to add? We already learned this. Tanina, Ezehu Mamzer. We'll say we already had. If that's the machlokes, Tanakam and Rabbi Huda, why would that be stated in the Mishnah? We already learned this once before. What did we learn? So the Gemara says, Ezehu Mamzer. Who's a mamzer? Kol shehu below yavel. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says, Rabbi say. Now remember, this is the famous shita of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva holds any prohibited relationship creates mamzerus, even if it's just what? Even if it's just a lav. So any person, just to give you an example, like if a Kohen marries a grusha. Now, what's the penalty for a Kohen marrying a grusha? It's a lav. It's a prohibition. It's a prohibition. Yet Rabbi Akiva says the offspring will be a mamzer. This is the position of Rabbi Akiva. Kol shebelo yavo. Any relationship that is prohibited ultimately again by a lav ultimately produces mamzer. Shimon HaTimani says Kol shechayav lav karis b'dei shamayim. Shimon HaTimani says any relationship which you are chayiv karis creates mamzerus. V'alocha kidvar. And the Brayse says the halacha follows him. Rabbi Yeshua Omer kol shechayav lo misas bezdin. And Rabbi Yeshua says ultimately any relationship that carries with it a chi of bezdin, a chi of misas bezdin, creates mamzerus. So we'll say the point over here the Gemara is making is that halacha l'maisa. You see that this machlokas is already stated. We already know this machlokas. At the end of the day, what creates a mamzer? So if we already have this machlokas on the books, why the need to restate it in our Mishnah? Eli, you're right. Ela Amarava. So Rava says, let's scrap that. That's not the machlokas Rabbi Yehuda and the Tanakama, because that is already a pre-existing machlokas. So once again, we're back to square one. So what is the machlokas Rabbi Yehuda and the Tanakama? Ela Amarava. Geramori umo avi ikabeneim. Machlokas is an Ammonite and a Moabite ger. What is this? That's what it means to say. Now I will say, remember, Ammon and Moab are unique. Why are they unique? Ammon and Moab, there is a prohibition upon the men to join the assembly of Hashem. Lo yavo Ammoni uMoavi b'kal Hashem. Now, we'll say, what's wrong with Ammon and Moab? What did they do? So remember again, two things. Number one, they didn't greet us with bread and water when we were traveling through the desert. And number two, they hired Bilam to go ahead and curse us. Now we know that the prohibition on Ammon and Moab, the prohibition of... Now remember, to be clear, a male member of Ammon, an Ammonite and a Moabite could convert. It's not a problem for them to become Jewish. What's the problem? What's the restriction? The restriction is on who they marry. Right? That's the restriction on who they marry. Now the prohibition only applies, interestingly enough, to men and not to women. So if a woman from Ammon and Moab or Moab converts, she's a Giores, she's a convert, and she's permitted immediate entry into Kal Hashem. Remember again, this was the big dispute that surrounded the conversion of Rus. Right? Rus was from the nation of Moab. Those who wanted to disqualify David HaMelech and say that he wasn't the true king, their primary point of disqualification was, you're not even Jewish. The Alter Baba Rus, right, wasn't the right. She was Jewish, but she wasn't allowed to marry in. A whole discussion there. So the Gemara says, that's the machlokes. What's the machlokes? So remember again, the Mishnah said anyone who is prohibited to go ahead and come into the Kal. Anyone who's prohibited to marry into the General Assembly, Umaynihu, and ultimately, what is this referring to? Ger Ammoni uMoavi. So, for example, the Mishnah is referring to Ammonite and a Moabite ger. So, what's the halacha? Mutarin lavo zebozeh. So, Tanakama holds any convert who is prohibited to marry into, or anyone who is prohibited to marry into the General Assembly, for example, an Ammonite or a Moabite ger are permitted to marry each other. So the Gemara says, okay, that's Tanakama saying, Ihachi, my Rabbi Huda Oser. So I'll say, so what does it mean when it says Rabbi Huda Asers? What is Rabbi Huda Asering? To which the Gemara says, Hachi Kama, that's what it means to say. Afapish Rabbi Huda Oser, ger b'mamzeres, even though Rabbi Huda holds normally that a ger is not permitted to marry mamzeres. So also, we've seen this in the last 3 days now, this position. Hanimili ger d'ray lava bakal. That's only true with a convert who could technically marry into the General Assembly. Aval ger amoni u'mo'avi de'ein ru'uyin lavo bakal, but a ger amoni and a ger mo'avi who can't marry into the General Assembly, low. In other words, they'll both say, this is actually very interesting. So Rabbi Huda, who normally holds that a ger can't marry a mamzeres, that's only when the ger is permitted to marry into the General Assembly. But if the ger can't marry into the General Assembly, for example, a ger amoni and a ger mo'avi, they are permitted to marry a mamzeres. So that's the machlokes. Okay, interesting. So we'll say, so it turns out that the machlokes, so the Tanakama, ultimately again is for ger amoni and ger mo'avi. Fascinating. Tanrabanan ben teisha shana v'yom ger amoni u'mo'avi mitzri ve'adomi kusi unisin chalal u'mamzer. So we'll say, listen to this. If you have a boy who's the age of 9 years old in one day, what's significant about the age of 9 years old in one day? That's considered to be the age at which the bia is a recognizable bia, a recognizable act. So if you have a child who is 9 years old in one day, he's a convert, whether he's an Ammonite, Moabite, Mitzri, Adomi, Kusi, we'll talk about the Kusim also, Nisin Chalo Mamzer, Sheba ala Kohenes va'ala Levia. So we'll say, so this boy has relations with a Kohenes or a Levia, or al Bas Yisrael. What's the halacha? Paslua. He invalidates her. What does it mean he invalidates her? She can no longer marry a Kohen. Right? Why? Because any woman who's had relations with someone who she's not permitted to marry can no longer marry a Kohen. No longer marry a Kohen. So this boy, because at 9 years old and one day his bia is acknowledged as a halachically valid bia, and he is in one of these categories of having some issue with yichus, the bia with him prevents her from marrying a Kohen going forward. Rabbi Yossi says, Kol shezaro posel posel, v'chol she'in zaro posel in a posel. Rabbi Yossi says, anyone whose offspring is posel, ultimately again puzzles a woman he has relations with. But any man whose offspring doesn't invalidate, isn't puzzle, ultimately again won't puzzle the woman. Okay, so also we'll see later on what exactly this position is coming to add. Rabbi Shmuel says, top of Ayin Hey 75a, Kol sha'atonose bito atanose almanuso. We'll say any case where you can marry a person's daughter, you could also marry his almana. So we'll say these are just different ways of espousing the genealogical principles. So anytime you can marry a person's daughter, you can marry his widow. V'chol she'i atanose bito, and in any case where the daughter would not be permitted, you would not be permitted to marry the widow. Okay, so we'll say let's analyze each of these. So the Gemara says, first of all, we'll say Ayin Ham with Aleph 75a, 3 lines down from the top. Ma'ika bein Tanakama bein Rabbi Yossi. So first of all, what's the distinction between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yossi? The first two positions that we mentioned. So the Gemara says, Ma'ika bein Tanakama bein Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yochanan, I'll tell you, Mitzri Sheni Ika beinayu. So Rabbi saying, interesting nafkamina would be a Mitzri Sheni, a second generation Mitzri. Second generation, Rabbi say, now remember, a Mitzri when he converts, ultimately is also prohibited from marrying into the general population. For how many generations? 3 generations. So we have what you call a Mitzri Rishon, a Mitzri Sheni, right? First generation Mitzri, second generation Mitzri, and then Mitzri Shlishi. The Mitzri Shlishi is permitted to marry in. First 2 generations, not third generation is. So I think I want to suggest that's the nafkamina between the 2 positions. How so? Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Mitzri Sheni Ikabenayah Tanakama Kol Mitzri Stam Ha'asar B'Kal Ka'amar Va'afilu Sheni Umiu Shlishi Lav Mitzri Kari Leidi Yisrael Ma'al Yehu. So it's according to the Tanakama, ultimately again, any Mitzri has the title of Asr Lavo Bakal. But yet again, I will say, if you're measuring it by offspring, then ultimately again, the offspring of a Mitzri Sheni is a Shlishi is going to be permitted. That would be the Nafkamina case. The Gemara says, Ushneim lo labdua elami koin gadol ba'almana. And both the Tanakama and Rabbi Yossi learn their respective shitos, ultimately again, through through the case of a Kohen Gadol to the Almana. What's the case? The Tanakama Savri, the Tanakama holds Ki Kohen Gadol ba'almana, Ma Kohen Gadol ba'almana. Just like if a Kohen Gadol marries an almana, so shebi asa ba'avera, the bia itself is prohibited, uposel ba, and ultimately again the bia invalidates her. Right? Again, I will say, not only is the relationship usher, but ultimately, again, bia with her, bia with this man, ultimately would preclude her from marrying anyone forward, from marrying another Kohen going forward. So to will say any case of a bia that is prohibited will passel the woman from marrying into the kahuna. Rabbi Yossi will say, Ki Kohen Gadol ba'almana, Ma Kohen Gadol ba'almana, shezara posel, zara posel uposel. Just like when a Kohen Gadol marries an almana, the offspring is passel, and therefore again the relationship itself passes her from the kahuna. Afkol shezara posel, so to any situation where a union produces blemished offspring, ultimately will preclude the woman from marrying into the kahuna going forward as well. This comes to exclude the case of Mr. Sheni, she'ein zaro pasel, where the offspring is not pasel. Okay, the Amrakra, because the pasuk says, Banim asher yuldu lahem dor shlishi yavo lahem bekal Hashem. So Rabbi will say, essentially what they're arguing about is just the rule. So how do you look? What is the source of her invalidation? Do we look at the nature of the bia, or do we look at the nature of the offspring? Okay, Rabbi Shmuel says, Kol sha'at. So say, remember, all of this, since the Mishnah is trying to come up with just principles. We're trying to come up with rules to try to figure out. Namely, again, we're trying to figure out two things. Number one, how do we know? Now we're switching gears a little bit. We're trying to figure out how do we know which type of relationships prohibit a woman from marrying into the kahuna going forward. But remember, where does this stem from? This stems from a conversation in the Mishnah of trying to figure out who is permitted to marry who. So all of this, I guess in truth is in general, Gemara is about making rules and making principles and trying to go, or categories, and trying to fit everything into those categories. That's what we're doing. Interesting. So Shmuel's principle, his rule was, any case where a Kohen, by the way, I should just clarify that, the you in all of these situations is a Kohen. Any case where a Kohen would be permitted to marry the offspring, the daughter of a particular union, the Kohen would also be permitted to marry the almana, the widow of that particular marriage as well. Of course, excluding a Kohen Gadol who can't marry a widow. The Choshiata no says bito, in any case where the Kohen could not marry the daughter of a particular union, you would not be permitted to marry the widow as well. So the Gemara says, "My ika ben Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Shmuel." So what is the difference between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shmuel? Amru ula ger amoni umoavi ika benayu. The nafkamin Rabbi Yossi would be the case of a ger amoni and a ger moavi. How so? Ushneim lo lamduha ela mikoin gadol ba'almona. And both Rabbi Yossi, if you take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi's in the short lines, about 6 lines in. Geramoni uavika benahu. The Rabbi Yossi posel, according to Rabbi Yossi, they'd be posel. The hayesh mizaro shuhu posel. Because remember again, the offspring of a geramoni germoavi, depending on what they have, right? If it's a boy, that offspring is going to be genealogically impaired, right? He's going to have a genealogical issue. Right, Rabbi Shimon, according to Rabbi Yossi, on the other hand, according to Rabbi Shimon, since ultimately again the daughter would be permitted, therefore again halacha lemaisa, the widow would be permitted as well. So let's go back to the Gemara. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi holds, Ki Kohen Gadol ba'almana. We look at the case of a Kohen Gadol marries an almana, Ma Kohen Gadol ba'almana shezaro pasel uposel, af kol shezaro pasel uposel. Just like by Kohen Gadol ba'almana, ultimately again the offspring is pasel, and therefore again the woman herself is psula from marrying into the kahuna. So therefore that becomes the paradigm. Shmuel says Kohen Gadol ba'almana, Ma Kohen Gadol ba'almana shekol zaro pasel. Listen, Shmuel will say like this: when a Kohen Gadol marries an almana, Rabbi was saying, all offspring is pasel, right? All offspring is pasel. So therefore, again, afkol shezaro pasel afilu nekevos. So I said the only case, interesting, the only case where a woman will become invalid or unable to marry into the kuna going forward is a case where the union produces a situation where all offspring is unfit. But I will say that's not the case over here, because by Ger Amoni and Ger Moavi, it's only the male offspring that's unfit, the female offspring is not. Lafuki Ger Amoni Umoavi, the Nekevos Havi Ksheros Lava Bakal. The Amar Mar, Amoni velo Amonis, Moavi velo Moavis. So I will say, fascinating halach in general, that the prohibition on Ammon and Moab, when we say that Ammon and Moab cannot come into Lo Yava Bakal Hashem, that's only on the men, not on the women. Interesting. Amr Rav Chis says as follows: Hakol Modim. Everyone agrees. Ba'amanas Isa shepsula lakunas. Well, it's an interesting case over. Everyone agrees with Almanas Isa. And I both say, now if you remember again, what does Isa mean in genealogical discussions? I both remember again, where do we have this lesson of Isa? Right? Kol ha'aratzos Isa li'aretz Yisrael, v'eretz Yisrael Isa leBavel. So Isa means, in the world of genealogy, Isa means like a mixture, right? Because dough is made of a mixture of ingredients. But in this context, essentially what it means is suffix. Suffix, right? There's some element of suffix about the kashrus. So what's the case of Amanas Isa? If you take a look at Rashi says Amanas Isa biksuvis mefarish amana suffix chalal shaisim ureves bisfekos baila bisfekos baila haya suffix vihi ba mikocho tavle svek svekos. Supposed to listen to this. So the case of Amanas Isa is the following situation: that a woman is married to a man, and the man is a suffix chalal. Suffix chalal. Now remember, chalal is the product of a union, right? Product of a union of illegal kohanic marriage. So there was a suffix. Is the husband a chalal, not a chalal? The woman marries, so Rachel marries Ruvain. Ruvain again, however there is a suffix, there's a suffix whether or not he's a chalal. Right? Well, maybe his mother was a grusha, she wasn't a grusha, the suffix Kiddushin, whatever the case was. So Ruvain is a suffix chalal. Rachel now is married to Ruvain, and now we'll say what happens? Ruvain dies. So as an almana, she's permitted to marry a Kohen. Right, not a Kohen Gadol, but she's permitted to marry a Kohen. But now what happens? So listen to this. Everyone agrees in the case of almanas Isa, shepsula lekuna, that she can't marry a Kohen. She can't marry a Kohen. Why? Because we must say again, she's a suffix chalala. To which the Gemara says, good. So man mekel bahani tanoi. So I say ultimately again, who in general is the most mekel in these discussions? Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, right? Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. Both say first wide line. The kamar kol sha'ata nose bito. Remember, Shmuel said, any case where you're permitted to marry the daughter of a particular union, you can marry the widow as well. In any case, ultimately, again, where you can't marry the daughter, ultimately, you can't marry the amana. So we'll say, what does this come to exclude? Almanas Isa. This case of the amana, who's married to the suffix chalal, shepsula lekuna. Ultimately, she can't marry to the kuna. She came married to the kuna. So Mar says, this comes to exclude the following position. What do we say? Disnan. Hey, Rabbi Shor Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseira Almanas Isa sheksher lekuna. So let's listen to this. Others say that the Almanas Isa, this case of the Almana, she's permitted to the kuna. Why? My taima have a svek sveka. Now both say it's a svek sveka, right? The Gemara says usvek sveka lekula. Svek sveka lekula. Now both say, Rashi points out over here. Well, say, in general, what does sveka mean? What does sveka mean? Usually, what does it mean? A double suffix. Now, there's no double suffix over here. There's no double suffix. Remember again, really, there's one suffix. What's the one suffix? Right? Is Reuben a chalal? Right? Is Reuben the now deceased husband a chalal? So look at Rashi. Rashi says sveka, baila haya suffix, vihi ba'a mikochol lihi pasal. So the way Rashi kind of understands it is sveka in this context means it's like a suffix once removed, so to speak. In other words, the suffix is not really in Rachel. Right? The suffix is not in Rachel. Who's the suffix in? In Ruvain, her now deceased husband. So the Gemara is calling that a svek seka. So apparently there's a school of thought that says, listen, you can be mekel on this case because the suffix for her is once removed. The shaila is, she was married to Ruvain, and was Ruvain a chalal or not? So again, in that kind of case, you'll have a school of thought that says that halacha l'maisa, she is permitted to go ahead and marry into the kuna. Both say the way the Rambam Paskins is not like that. The way the Rambam Paskins is that Almanas Isa is asura to marry into the kuna. Then in this case, halacha l'maisa, where Rachel was married to Ruvain, and Ruvain was a safek chalal, and now Ruvain dies, we do not let her marry into the kuna, because ultimately, again, she may be psula. Okay, tomorrow goes weiter. Vadon bevadon mutar. So remember again, we said before that Allah in the Mishnah that someone who is vadai pasal, right? So remember again, this was the third part of the Mishnah. So the third part of the Mishnah will say was vada'an bivada'an mutar. So for example, those who are certainly have genealogical issues, right, can marry other people who are also certain genealogical issues. So for example, a mamzer could marry a mamzer, the Mishnah says. But for example, vadan bivada'an is mutar. This is the position of Rabbi Eliezer. This is the remember again of Tanakama, Rabbi Huda, and then Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer comes along and says only genealogically blemished people on the same level can marry each other. So for example, a mamzer can marry a mamzer, but a mamzer couldn't marry a shtuki. Right? Or for that matter, in Rabbi Eliezer's world, even a shtuki couldn't marry a shtuki. Right? Why? Because again, a shtuki is a safek, and maybe one shtuki is fine, one shtuki is not fine. So really only people with, I will call it certified genealogically blemished issues could go ahead and marry each other. Fine. So the Gemara goes right there. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav, halach Rabbi Eliezer. Says halach is like Rabbi Eliezer. We'll say that really again. So we'll say I just want to point out this incredible like array of positions over here. So you've got the Tanakama. Tanakama says, listen, here's the good news. The good news is, right? The bad news is there are certain people who, because of their genealogical issues, cannot marry into the general marriage pool. That's the bad news. What's the good news? The good news is all of those people could marry each other. Okay, so essentially there's a primary marriage pool and a secondary marriage pool. Okay, so fine. Rabbi Eliezer comes along and restricts it even further. And Rabbi Eliezer says, no, there's not a secondary marriage pool. There is a secondary marriage pool, but it's actually much smaller than according to the Tanakama. Because in Rabbi Eliezer's secondary marriage pool, essentially, only people who have a certified genealogical issue could marry each other. Anyone who is excluded from the primary pool because of potential genealogical issues, they can't marry within each other. Why? Because all those people are Suffolk. You can't pair up Suffolk people with Suffolk people, and you can't pair up Suffolk people with Vadai people. Why? Because Rabbi say in Suffolk there's always a possibility that what? That they're fine. In which case you're making shidduchim between people with good genealogy or unblemished genealogy with blemished genealogy. So therefore, again, Rabbi Eliezer's model, pretty much the only people marrying each other, both say, are mamzerim to mamzerim, or mamzerim to nesinim, or possibly, again, depending how we come out on the kusi issue, mamzerim to kusim. That's it. But everyone else is excluded. So the Gemara says, Rav says, Rabbi Eliezer. Can't be sikmei the Shmuel. It said in front of Shmuel, Amrali Hillel Shona Asari Yochsim Alumi Bavel the Kulumi Tarn Lavozeh Viat Amrit Halach Rabbi Eliezer. And Abba said, here's the problem. So Shmuel says, how can you say that Rav said that the halacha follows Rabbi Eliezer? Rabbi say, what was the opening Mishnah of the parak? Opening Mishnah of the parak was Asara Yuchsim Alumi Bavel. There ultimately again were 10 genealogical classes that came out from Bavel. And remember again, and what's the halacha? The halacha is they're all permitted to marry into each other. In other words, all of the genealogically blemished groups are permitted to marry into each other. They're all permitted to intermarry. That was the wrong word, but you understand, right? They're all permitted to marry within each other. So that's the halacha. If you have a genealogical issue, which unfortunately, through no fault of your own, causes you to be limited in terms of marrying to the general population, the good news is you have this whole other group that you could still be a part of. So that conscience we just said before. So the Gemara says, "Va'at amrei talach Rabbi Eliezer, v'Rami d'Rav d'Shmuel d'Shmuel." They both say it would seem to be that the positions of Rav and Shmuel contradict. So both say. So what comes out over here is you have Rav saying that halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer, saying that essentially only people with certified genealogical issues could marry each other. Any safek case cannot marry into that pool. And Shmuel saying that's not true. The halacha follows the first Mishnah, and the first Mishnah said that halacha l'maaseh any of these situations where the people have genealogical issues, they're all permitted to marry into each other. To which the Gemara said, yeah, we have a contradiction. Deitmar, interesting case here. Arusa she'ibra. What's this in this case? You have a woman who's in Arusa. She has Erisin, and now she's pregnant. Okay. Little bit of an issue, right? Because remember again, she's not living with her husband. So what's that? Rav Amrav Vlad Mamzer. So Rav says straight out, the kid is a mamzer. And I both say, now why is that? So Rav says ultimately again, because we don't go after, right? We say ultimately again that we assume that she's pregnant from the rove. Now both say the rove of people in the world are not her husbands, right? Which means that what? We just go after the rove. We say the rove, we make the rove like the vadai, and therefore we say the baby is a mamzer. Shmuel says, Avlat shtuki. Shmuel says, no, hold up, right? Let's assume that the child ultimately again is a shtuki. So the Gemara says, Rav Amar Havlad Mamzer Umuteres Mamzeres. So Rav says ultimately again, the child's mamzer, the child can marry mamzeres. So Shmuel Amar Havlad Shtuki Va'aser B'Mamzeres. And Shmuel will say ultimately again, the offspring is a shtuki, and therefore again, a shtuki is not permitted to marry a mamzeres. So Rav will say, so what's the idea over here? So the point over here is that according to Rav, we make a suffix like a vadai, and according to Shmuel, we don't make a suffix like a vadai. That contradicts what we just said before. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Eifuch, just change around the positions. Rav Amar Havlad Shtuki, Shmuel Amar Havlad Mamzer. No, say that Rav holds that the offspring is a shtuki, and Shmuel says that the offspring is a mamzer. Fine. So the Gemara says, Tarti Lamali. So if that's the case, why do I need two cases illustrating the same principles? I'll tell you why. If we would have just said this case, in the previous case, remember again, the majority of people are ksherim. Therefore, again, that's why Rav says this position. In the case of Erusin, the rov psulim etzla, where the majority of men are apostle to her because she's married, ema moldi leila Shmuel. I would say that ultimately, again, he would agree with Shmuel. And ultimately, again, we would only say the Arusa case, because you could always attribute the baby to the aros, to the husband. Maybe in that case he agrees with Shmuel, therefore tzvicha. The other possibility is, no, don't switch around the positions in the second case of the arusa. What does it mean when Rav says the offspring is a mamzer? It doesn't mean ultimately again that the offspring is a mamzer in that it'll be permitted to a mamzeres. Ella the aser bebas Israel. Rather, it's coming to say that the offspring is usher to marry a regular Jew or regular Jewish woman. Shmuel says havlad shtuki the usher bebas Yisrael. When Shmuel says the child is a shtuki, it also means can't marry a Jewish woman. If that's the case, hainu dirav. Then Shmuel is saying the same thing as Rav. Ela shtuki shemishaskin oso midin kahuna. Rather, shtuki means that ultimately, again, we kind of silence him from any claim to the kahuna. Pshita, that's obvious. Midin yisrael mashtikin lei. If he's not permitted to marry Yisraelis, midin kulam mibai, then ultimately, again, there's any shaychas to the kahuna. Ela my shtuki. Rather, what does shtuki mean? Shemishaskin oso minichse aviv. Ultimately, again, that he has no right to any inheritance from his father. Obviously, Rabbi say pshita miya din avu amanu. He's a shtuki. We'll say, what's a shtuki? We don't know the father. If we don't know the father, then of course he doesn't have any claim to inheritance. To which the Gemara says miya din avu amanu lotzricha de tafis. Rabbi say the case can be where the son or the child sees property, claiming I know who my father was. Right? I know my father was, and therefore I'm claiming this as my inheritance. The other possibility is my shtuki. Beduki. What's a shtuki? A shtuki is a beduki, meaning what? Shebotkin es imo va'omeres l'kasher nivalti ne'emenes. That ultimately, I will say, what's the shtuki? Shtuki is a beduki, meaning when a woman becomes pregnant and we don't know the father, we ask her, who is the father of your baby? And she names a man. We believe her. So the Gemara says, "Ne'emenes kiman Rabbi Gamliel the Amar Rabbi Gamliel." So the Gemara says, "I already learned this. Ha'amar shmuel chadazim. We already learned this once before. This nan haisimu beretz va'amar lamati v'shal uberzeh. If a woman is pregnant, unmarried, and we ask her who is the father of this baby, and she says what? She says mi'ish ploni v'kohen hu. She claims, my right, Reuven is the father of my baby, and Reuven is a kohen. Rabbi Gamliel. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Eliezer, Omrim ne'emenes. Rabbi Gamliel says she's believed. Rabbi Yeshua Omer Eina Ne'emenes. Rabbi Yeshua says she's not believed. Rabbi Yehuda Meshmuel Halacha Rabbi Gamliel. Halacha Zek Rabbi Gamliel. So Gemara says tzrichas. Why did in both cases? Tzricha. Both say first of the widest lines. Di'ime Hasam. If we would have just said the previous case, Hava Amina Hasam Rav Ksherim Etzla. Both say in a case where she is unmarried, there's much greater reason to believe her. Why? Because we'll say when a woman is unmarried, the majority of men, the rove, says that what? The father of her baby is a kosher. Because the majority of men in the world are permitted to her. And therefore, again, that's maybe why we believe her. Aval hacha, but we'll say in the case of an arusa, remember again, what's the arusa case? The arusa case is where a woman, right, Rachel is betrothed to Ruvain, right? Erusin, they're not living together. Rachel becomes pregnant, right? And now we'll say, in that case, the rove is asura to her. I would have thought that maybe she shouldn't be believed ultimately to say that the baby is kosher. Therefore, tzricha. So Tanya, v'chein Rabbi Elazar Omer. So okay, so fine. So before we go on, I will say the point over here. Well, I know we did that fast, and I apologize for that. But I will say, but Lamaisa again. What's the point of contention over here? Machlokes Rav and Shmuel. That's the idea of Machlokes Rav and Shmuel. Rav says that halacha follows Rabbi Eliezer. And what does Rabbi Eliezer say? What does Rabbi Eliezer say? Rabbi Eliezer says that halacha lamaisa, only vadai can marry a vadai, right? Only someone who is certifiably genealogically blemished could marry someone else in that same category. Now, it doesn't have to be the same category, but it does have to be the same status. Same status. But let's say a vadai couldn't marry a safeg. So in Eliezer's world, a mamzer can't marry a shtuki, right? Or an asufi, right? So again, and now Shmuel says, 1 second. So that's Rabbi Eliezer, and Rav says that the halacha follows Rabbi Eliezer. Comes along Shmuel, and Shmuel said, well, Hillel taught us the previous Mishnah. And in the first Mishnah of the parak, we said that what? All of the genealogically blemished classes could all what? Could all what? Marry into each other. That's the machlokes. That's the machlokes, and that's our kind of machlokes that sits on the backdrop of all this. And I will say, understand that's a doozy, right? That's a big machlokes. That's a big machlokes, because already remember again those who unfortunately through no choice, through no fault of their own, through no fault of their own, are already dealing with a little bit of a genealogical issue. So according to according to Shmuel, at least there is a whole other subset, right? Everyone who has this issue is at least in the same category. So okay, I will say, so there is like another kahal, so to speak. There's another kahal. According to Rav, who holds like Rabbi Eliezer, the marriage pool is that much more restricted. Now, I will say, just as an aside, by the way, how do we pass? We're going to go on right now, but as an aside, the case of the Arusa is a very interesting case, right? What do we do with this case of the Arusa? A woman, right? Rachel has erusin with Ruvain, and now again I will say now she's pregnant. So I will say, so what do we do? What do we do with that offspring? So again, there's two subsets of those cases, right? Case number one is where both Ruvain and Rachel say, okay, yeah, it's ours. Right, whatever. We were opening wedding presents together, and whatever, whatever. So, right, okay, but it's ours. Then I will say, then Lamai said, there's a different case where, let's say, Ruvain says, not mine, right? Not mine. So what do we? So again, we'll come back to that case. But Lamai said two different. Good. So let's go weiter. Says the Gemara. Let's go weiter. Where did we just leave off? V'chein amar Rabbi Elazar. Amar kusi. I'm sorry. V'chein Rabbi Elazar amar kusi lo yisa kusis. A kusi shouldn't marry a kusis. Now, again, I will say once again. So now kusim, we saw in the Mishnah. That what's the issue with kusim? Kusim converted, but kusim converted under duress because of the outbreak of lions in Eretz Yisrael after they were resettled by the king of Assyria, by the king of Ashur. The problem with kusim, we're going to get to this in Amud Beis, the problem with kusim is, was the conversion legitimate or not? Because they were found ultimately to be worshipping idolatry afterwards. So therefore, again, there's a whole suffix in their identity. So therefore, Abelaz says like this: a kusi shouldn't marry a kusis. My time, what's the reason? Rav Yosef, asua kiger la'achar asara doros. Now, Abelaz says this is interesting. Now, because they made the kusi like a convert after 10 generations. And Abelaz say, now, what's the concept of? Let's see, Disanya. This is actually fascinating. Ger. Adasara daros mutar b'mamzeres. Now, both say we paskin halacha l'maisa that a ger is permitted to go ahead and marry a mamzeres. So both say. So here's what's interesting: a convert up to 10 generations, which means Rabbi say somebody converted, so within 10 generations after conversion, they're permitted to marry a mamzeres. Mikan ve'ilech, after that, asr mamzeres. You're not allowed to marry a mamzeres. Rabbi say, now what's the logic behind that? The logic behind that, Rabbi say, is, well, let's see, some say, ad she'ishtaka shem avodas kochav mimenu. Rabbi say, the ideal here is as follows. How long, the question is when a person converts, how long are they known as converts? It's an interesting discussion, right? I was supposed to say a person converts into Klal Yisrael. How long do they have the shem ger? So essentially, what the Gemara is saying is like this: pretty much like as long as they have the shem ger, they're permitted to go ahead and marry mamzeres. So the first opinion says, how long does the person have a shem ger? 10 generations. 10 generations, which tells you sometimes like how people are in terms of like putting people into boxes, which is an interesting idea. Up till 10 generations, the shem ger is on the family, and therefore they're permitted to go out and marry mamzeres. Second opinion, Yesh Omrim saying no. How long does a family, or does a family have the shem ger, the shem convert over them? Until they don't. Until they don't. And I will say, what does it mean until they don't? Right? That's a subjective amount. Right? And you see this, by the way, there are some people who convert and integrate very beautifully, and again, the concept they converted becomes very quickly forgotten. And some people who convert and have difficulty integrating. It's one of the challenges. I will say, often say like one of the things that our community lacks, especially in the Frum community, is we have a process for conversion. We often don't have a good process for integration, right? We know how to get people like into the mikvah. Just once they come out, it's like no one's standing there with a towel and like a welcome basket, So we know how to make people Jewish. We aren't really good at integrating people. That's why I both say it's an unspoken thing. But like the relapse rate after conversion is much higher than we like to acknowledge, because again I will say, when a person is in the process of converting, it's interesting. So often like it's like, oh, come for Shabbos and this and that, and it's so exciting, and then like they convert. So once they convert, they're Jewish. Well, if you're Jewish, I could ignore you. I don't really have to. I'm not nice to a lot of Jews, right? So if I'm not nice to like most Jews, so I don't really have to be nice. And I will say, just the traumatic experience that it creates for people. And Rahman al-Islam, the number of people who after they convert say like, you know what, I made a terrible mistake. Like I need to go back. It's heartbreaking. And it exists. So the Gemara says over here something amazing. So the Gemara says pretty much you have the status of a convert up until the identity of a convert fades away. And again, that's a subjective amount. So until it's forgotten. Abai says, 1 second. Mi dami hasam ger yashnu amzeres chadasha. So I will say, so therefore again the Gemara says like this. The Gemara says a kusi can't marry a kusis. Now why not? I will say, what's the logic? So the logic the Gemara says is because the man is considered to be like a ger after 10 generations, or a ger after the identity of gerus has faded away. And if he marries a kusis, it looks like there's a regular Jew marrying a kusis. So the Gemara says, I don't understand that. The Gemara says, Amri bar Yisrael hu Kanasim mamzeres. So you're telling me now that the issue is that if a kusi marries a kusis, the male kusi is like a convert after 10 generations, or after convert whose identity of a convert is no longer really known. He's looked at as a regular guy, and therefore people will see him as a regular Jew marrying a kusis or a mamzeres. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. I will say, if it's a kusi marrying a kusis, then what? They're the same. If they're the same, I don't understand. What is the issue? Rabbi Shmuel Silber Rabbi Akiva. Now we'll say, watch this. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff going on over here. Rather, if Dimi said like this, here is the issue. Do you know why a kusi can't marry a kusis? Because Rabbi Eliezer holds like Rabbi Shmuel, and Rabbi Shmuel holds like Rabbi Akiva. What does that mean? Okay, a lot to unpack over here. First line, Ayin Her base, or now second line, 75b. Rabbi Elazar, Sarvalak Rabbi Yishmael, Damar Kusim Gere Arayosem. So first of all, I will say again, in general, there's a machlokes about Kusim. Are Kusim Jewish or not? Right? Or are they right? So first of all, Rabbi Elazar holds like Rabbi Shmuel, and Rabbi Shmuel holds that Kusim were Gere Arayos. Kusim were not really legitimate converts, but rather they only converted because of the fear of lions. Right? There was an outbreak of lions in Eretz Yisrael. They converted because they figured, hey, if we're Jewish, we'll be saved from the lions. Well, take a look at Rashi. Take a look at Rashi. So Geira Arayos v'harihin kishar ovdei kochavim sherasu benos Yisrael. So we'll say now, watch this. This is incredible. So Rabbi Shmuel holds that kusim are Geira Arayos. If they're Geira Arayos, so we'll say, then that means they're not Jewish. That's what Rabbi Shmuel is saying. They're not Jewish, and therefore, again, when a kusi marries the Israelis, when a kusi marries a Jewish woman, it's no different than any other non-Jew who fathers a child with a Jewish woman. I will say, so part one is Rabbi Eliezer holds like Rabbi Shmuel. That's number one, right? And Rabbi Shmuel holds that kusim really aren't Jewish. That's Aleph. Rabbi Shmuel is like Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Shmuel is like Rabbi Akiva. The Amar Oved Kochavim ve'Eved Abba Bas Yisrael Havlad Mamzer. Wow. So we'll say, watch this. So step number one is that Rabbi Eliezer holds like Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel holds kusim aren't Jewish. Okay, that's step one. Step two, Rabbi Shmuel, and by extension Rabbi Eliezer, hold like Rabbi Akiva. What does Rabbi Akiva say? Remember again, Rabbi Akiva is the most machmir shita when it comes to genealogical issues. He holds that any time you have a marriage that is prohibited, even if it's just by a love, the resulting offspring are mamzerim. Therefore, again, we'll say, here's what we know. Kusim married Jewish women. Right, Kusi married Jewish woman. Well, if you hold that a Kusi is really an Akum, is a non-Jew, and the non-Jew married a Jewish woman, then according to Rabbi Akiva, what's the status of the resulting offspring? Mamzerim. And therefore, again, Abba say, so we'll say, that's it. That's it. So why can't a Kusi marry a Kusis? Why can't the Kusi marry a Kusis? Because both a Kusi and a Kusis both are what? Safek Mamzerim. Safek Mamzerim. Right? That's the issue over here. So remember again, if you put this all together, therefore Allah Kusi can't marry a Kusis, because remember again, the original Kusim weren't legitimate converts. And again, when they married Jewish women, so those were illegal marriages. And a Rabbi Akiva holds that illegal marriages produces mamzerim. Therefore, anyone who identifies as a kusi essentially is a safek mamzer. And therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, you can't have one kusi marry another kusi. That's the rationale. That's the rationale ultimately again for Rabbi Eliezer's statement. Incredible. To which the Gemara says, one second. Umi savarla Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Akiva. There's Rabbi Shmuel holding Rabbi Akiva. Vam Rabbi Yochanan Mishra Rabbi Shmuel. Minayin la'ovid kocham be'aved hashabal al kohenes va'al haLeviyah va'al bas Yisrael shepasluha. We'll say, how do we know? How do we know that halacha l'maisa? Right now, remember again, this is Rabbi Yochanan saying of Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel says, how do I know that if an Oved Kochav, a Menakum, a non-Jew, or an Eved has relations with a Kohenes, or a Leviah, or a Bas Yisrael, Shepaslua, that now these women can't marry into the Kuna? Shneimar, Ubas Kohen, Kisihye Almana, Ugrusha, Vezera Ein Lo. The Pasuk says, the Bas Kohen will be an Almana, or a Grusha, and again, remember, we'll say, this is just a regular daughter of a Kohen, regular Bas Kohen, who marries Yisrael, marries a guy, and what happens? She's either widowed or divorced, and she has no offspring. Then Allah Chalamaysa, she's permitted to go back to her father's home and resume eating truma. So the Gemara says, Mishi Yeshla Almanos Gerushin. So we'll say this refers to someone who technically could be widowed or divorced. Yatsa Oved Kochavim ve'Eved she'ein lo Almanos v'Gerushin. We'll say this comes to exclude a woman who is married to an Oved Kochavim or an Eved, where again we'll say there is no concept of Almanos or Gerushin. So the Gemara says, now, if you would hold that Allah, if you would think that Rabbi Shmuel is like Rabbi Akiva, hashta mamzer havi. So I will say, if the resulting offspring is a mamzer, mifsal bebi asami bai, do you even need a drasha that says that Allah she becomes invalidated through the bia with these men? In other words, if the union produces mamzerus, then it goes without saying that she would be invalid to go ahead and continue to eat truma. So I will say it must be. So therefore, we're challenging the fact that Rabbi Shmuel clearly doesn't hold of Rabbi Akiva. Ella Rabbi Elazar Savarlak Rabbi Shmuel. Watch this, I will say. Rather, let's go back for just a second. Let's go back. Remember, we have a very simple mission. What are we trying to figure out? What are we trying to figure out? Rabbi Elazar makes a statement. What's his statement? His statement is Kusim can't marry each other. So why not? So we'll say it's a new approach. Ella Rabbi Elazar Savarlak Rabbi Shmuel Damar Kusim Gerai Rayos. Rather, we'll say you have to say like this. Rabbi Elazar holds like Rabbi Shmuel who holds Kusim, they were not legitimate converts. That's number one. For Savarlak Rabbi Akiva da Amar, Oved Kochavim ve'Eved haba Bas Yisrael havlad mamzer. And he holds, ultimately again, like Rabbi Akiva, who holds that an Oved Kochavim and an Eved who has relations with the Bas Yisrael, the offspring is a Mamzer. Umisar Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Akiva. I was saying Rabbi Lazar hold like Rabbi Akiva. V'ha'amar Rabbi Lazar Afa Pi Shenechleku B'Shem Beisil B'Tsaros Modim She'ein Mamzer Ela Mimi She'isuro Isser Erva V'Anish Kais. I will say here it is. Here it is. Even though Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel will say argue. What do they argue? They will say they argue in the case of a Tsaras Erva, the co-wife of a woman who's in Erva. They will say they both agree that what? That ultimately Mamzerus is only created from someone who is an Isser Erva and punishable by Kares. I will say, going back to the earlier part of this daf, so that's a machlokes also, right? Is it just an Isser Kares, Isser Misa, is Isser Misa, go boldly down the side. But the point, we'll say, what's the point? The point is, we reject the position of Rabbi Akiva. So it's clear that no one holds like Rabbi Akiva. So how can you go ahead and say that Rabbi Elazar holds like Rabbi Akiva? Elo, ki asa Ravin, Amr Rabbi Chibar, Abba, Amr Rabbi Yochanan, Amr Rabbi Arba, Zrada, Amr Rabbi Chanina, Amr Rabbi Yaakov, Bar Idi, Amr Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Shalosh machlokos bedavar. Here it is, Rabbi say. 3 machlokim, right? Rabbi say, kusim are so complicated, right? Kusim are so complicated. In fact, I will say it is a 3-way machlokes about how to deal with kusim. Here we go. I will say, here we go. This is actually riveting. Rabbi Shmuel Silber. Rabbi Shmuel says, he says, kusim gerarayo, saying kusim. So we'll say first opinion, Rabbi Shmuel, kusim are not Jewish. We'll say Geire Arayos is another way of saying that their conversion was not legitimate. They are not Jewish. They are not Jewish. And what happens? V'kohanim shnitmu bahen kohanim psulin hayu shneimar vayas lahem miktsosam kohane bamos. So I will say this is just fascinating. So here's what we know. We'll say the Kusim. Okay, so number one, the Kusim converted. The issue is the Kusim also kind of made their own breakaway religion, right? Hiring their own kohanim, right? How did they get kohanim? Right? I would say they got legit kohanim. How did they get legit kohanim? They paid well, right? In other words, it was a good benefits package, right? So Lamaisa, they actually got kohanim to work in their temples. So the Gemara says, listen to this: Vayas lahem miktsosam kohane bamos. They made miktsosam again. The Kohanim Bamos. They made Kohanim to, again, I will say, legit, they got Kohanim, real Kohanim, to offer up to be the priests in their temples, on their altars. I will say this is interesting. So who are the Kohanim ultimately again that they got to go ahead and serve in their Beis HaMikdash, serve in their temples? They recruited the Kohanim who had genealogical issues. So Kohanim who would not have normally been fit to go ahead and serve in the Beis HaMikdash in the Mishkan, ultimately again, so the Kusim recruited them. So Rabbi say, so now you have like this perfect genealogical storm. What do you have? You have Kusim who aren't Jewish, recruiting Kohanim, right, who are genealogically impaired, and then ultimately again, all of these people start marrying into each other. It is a genealogical mess. Umishum hachi paslinhu. So I will say, so therefore again, the whole thing is a mess. But I will say, but really, the genesis of the mess is what? Kusim are Jewish. So that's the first step. That's Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Akiva Savar, Kusim Geri Emesein. Wow. Rabbi Akiva will say, holds the Kusim are legitimate converts. They're legitimate converts. I will say, remember, everyone's agreeing, unfortunately, the Kusim relapsed. But I will say, after a person converts and they relapse, that doesn't necessarily invalidate their conversion. So Rabbi Akiva holds that the conversion itself is a totally legitimate conversion. Kohanim shnitmu bahem, Kohanim ksherim. And wow, the Kohanim who came to serve in their temples were legitimately kosher Kohanim. Shneimar, vayas lahem mikitzosam Kohani bamos, v'amar Rabbi Bechana, Amr Rabbi Yochanan, mina bechirim sheba'am. This is tragic. Who do they recruit? They recruited some of the best Kohanim. Some of the best Kohanim to serve in their temples. So we'll say if that's the case. So we'll say if halacha l'maisa, that Kusim are legitimate converts, and the Kohanim who came to work for them were legitimate Kohanim, unblemished Kohanim. So why is it an issue to marry for Kusim to marry into the Kusim to marry each other? That's saying this is this. We'll say so why Kohanim aser? So why Kusim aser? Top of Ayin Vav. I'll say third daf today. I just want to point out upotrim es hanasuos. We'll say ultimately again. This is fascinating. So we'll say this is fascinating. We'll say you know why? What they did is they did yibum with arusos and not with nesuos. In other words, that if a woman was widowed from Erisin, they did Yibum or Chalitza, but if she was widowed from Nisuin, they didn't do Yibum or Chalitza. Now from Erisin, that's fine. The problem is they didn't do Yibum from Nisuin. Someone says, whoa, what is that? My Darshi, what is that? So the Gemara says, Lo tiya ishes hameis hachutza leish zar. So Rabbi say, ultimately again, they dash in the following. The pasuk says, the ishes hameis, the widow of the man who died, shouldn't be hachutza, shouldn't marry out to someone else, to a foreign man. Hach, so Rabbi said, this is not the dash in the pasuk. Hach diyas v'chutza, hach diyas v'chutza, he lo siya leish zar. The one ultimately Rabbi said was chutza. The woman who never lived with her husband, she is the one who can't marry someone else. She is one who's subject to Yibum. But she who lived with her husband, who wasn't chutza, tzia ishzar, she's not subject to Yibum. So I will say a totally warped drasha. And Rabbi Akiva l'tamei the Amar yesh mamzer mechayvei lavin. And ultimately again, Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that Allah l'maisa any union that is prohibited by a lav, ultimately again produces mazar. So we also have to stop over here. So again, this is really exciting because these are the Gemaras that get into why is it that a kusi isn't permitted to marry. And Rabbi, what you begin to see is because at least now again, there's a saying of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is going to say, Allah l'maisa, kusim, totally legitimate conversion. Kohanim, they recruited totally legitimate Kohanim. So what happened? They made a mistake in Yibum. But as a result of the mistake in Yibum, they had marriages which were only prohibited by a lav. But Rabbi Akiva also say even a union prohibited by a lav still produces what? Mamzerim. And as a result, the kusim were overrun by a proliferation ultimately of mamzerim. Therefore, he came right into the kusim. I will say, shkoyach.